Hello and welcome to this video. I'm Marcus Hayes, and today, despite everything I said yesterday, I've ended up getting around the garage late again. As I mentioned in yesterday's video, today is going to be all about Maude, my 2-litre Zetec powered Mk2 Escort MOREDOOR, which according to someone who was trolling my YouTube comments last night, is just an old 4-door beater, which I can definitely agree with. According to him, I should spend thousands and thousands converting Maude into a 2-door. Which to me doesn't make sense, because this seems a lot easier to fill the car up with tyres and tools and take her to a drift day. He suggested that I buy the Irish panels that are now available, which are actually made in China. But to me that seems like a waste of money on a Rattle drift car. Something came up this morning which meant I very nearly didn't make it to Southern Axle Services to pick up Maude's freshly rebuilt L.S.D, but I'm so glad that I did make it, because if I didn't pick it up today, I wouldn't have been able to pick it up till after the weekend, and I really want to get Maude back on the road in the next couple of days. I've also been down to see A.R.VALLI to pick up the spreader plates that he's made for me, which should mean that the new Neil-done SUMP doesn't leak oil, fingers crossed. And I'll go into more detail about those parts when I actually fit them to the car. It might be today or it might be tomorrow. What I want to focus on first today is trying to suss out what exactly is causing the rattle that's coming from inside Maude's bell housing. Before I can do that, I need to lower the engine down and remove the gearbox. And before I can do that, I've got a few bits that I need to disconnect before I get the hoist out. I did give myself a head start disconnecting the front suspension and the anti-roll bar, but there's still a few other bits that I need to remove. And it's all really mundane stuff that I've already shown on the channel, and because I've got round here really late, I want to try and hit the ground running. So I'm going to crack on with that, and then I'll catch up with you afterwards and I'll show you exactly what I've done. Right, so I've been at it quite a while. I've had a bit of a wardrobe change. I've put the greasy clothes back on that I was wearing the other day, so I can wear the clean clothes to drive Winston home later, because if I get grease on Kat's seat, she's going to murder me. I've disconnected quite a lot of stuff, some of which I might have got away with not disconnecting, but there's no rush for this car to be back on the road, so I thought I'd make the job as easy as possible. Right, I'll start in the engine bay. First I've disconnected the negative terminal from the battery. I've also disconnected the earth wire that went to the block. I've disconnected the fuel pipe from the carburetor. And I've also disconnected the crank sensor and the coil pack wires and tucked them right out of the way. I don't want them getting damaged. Disconnected the oil catch can pipe from there and also from the flame trap. Disconnected the radiator hoses, and I've disconnected the starter motor. That'll have to be removed before I can get the gearbox off, but I can probably do that after I've lowered the engine down. And I've removed the throttle cable from here. I'll just tuck that out of the way. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything in the engine bay. Basically anything that's connected to the engine I've just disconnected and moved out of the way. Inside the car I've disconnected the steering column from the dash and just pulled it through the bulkhead, and I've also removed the shifter from the gearbox. Underneath the car I've removed the clutch cable, which I need to move out of the way, and also the speedo drive which goes into the gearbox. Pulled that out and moved it out of the way. And I've undone the exhaust from its mounts so that I could disconnect the rest of the exhaust system from the exhaust manifold. This bit of the exhaust where it slots onto the exhaust manifold is actually damaged, but luckily the exhaust manifold goes into about here, so I'll probably cut some slits carefully in this bit, and then I can just put the clamp here. So that should live to tell another story. I've got the jack underneath the gearbox, and I still need to undo the gearbox mounts, and I need to set the hoist up to take the weight of the engine, and then I'll be able to undo the 2 bolts each side that hold the cross member into the chassis, and then I'll be able to lower the engine down onto a trolley. Right, so the engine and gearbox have now been lowered out of the car. Got the engine sitting on a trolley, and I've got the gearbox sitting on the jack. Now some of you might be wondering why I'm not disconnecting the gearbox from here, seeing as this has got like a quick release set up on it. Well, first of all, I'm going to be changing the sump tomorrow, so I would have needed to disconnect all the front suspension anyway, but the truth is I never had much luck trying to disconnect the gearbox from the bell housing with the quick release bolts. I think it might be something to do with the fact that I'm using these GS Escort lowering blocks, which basically mean that you don't need to re-weld the gearbox mounts in the tunnel in a different position. Basically these work as like an adapter, so the blocks bolt to the gearbox tunnel brackets here, and then the gearbox bracket itself bolts here. Now I think if you did move these brackets into the other position, which is how I used to have a Type 9 bolted into my Mark 1, you might be alright getting on these Allen key bolts with a long flexible bar or whatever, or certainly if you had a larger gearbox tunnel, it would definitely make it a lot easier. And I know that some people just mount the Type 9 through the floor using a Capri mount, and I think if you had it mounted that way, it also would be a lot easier to use these quick release bolts. But now that the engine and gearbox are lowered down, it's really easy for me to undo the bell housing bolts and just pull the gearbox off of the engine. So now I'm going to remove the starter motor, and I can take the bolts out that hold the bell housing to the engine block and then just pull the gearbox off. We've got a casualty. I forgot to undo that earth strap, so it's basically just pulled the wire out from the ring terminal. So I'll have to repair that later on. Right, so I've got the gearbox off. Had a little bit of grief trying to get the bell housing past the exhaust manifold. Now I'm going to grind some of this bell housing away, just so that it makes it easier in future to fit and remove the gearbox. I couldn't do that before because I used to be running a genuine Mk2 Escort RS2000 bell housing, and obviously I don't want to be grinding away parts that are genuine, but this is an aftermarket alloy bell housing. Right, so one of the things that I think might be causing the noise is the clutch fork, because there's quite a lot of play between the clutch fork and this pivot pin. Now I'm glad that for once this pivot pin has stayed in. I did araldite it in there. So I don't know if maybe in the future I should buy a brand new clutch fork. I don't have one at the moment. I know Burton Power do sell them. But as I've said in previous videos, eventually I'll be changing this light flywheel because I don't like it. It's an IK Engineering one, and I don't like the fact that the starter motor doesn't engage properly without me modifying the starter so that it sits closer to the ring gear. So I will be changing that eventually. I need to find another brand of clutch to use because the AP Racing ones are now obsolete for a Pinto, because this is running a Pinto clutch, and they're just not up to the job. I killed one earlier in the year. So eventually I'll be changing the flywheel and the clutch. And then if I'm not able to solve the rattle this time, then I can always buy a brand new clutch fork then. Now one thing that I can already see, which I'm not sure will be picked up by the camera, is the fact that these fingers on this pressure plate are not even at all. The ones up here are way more sunk in than the ones down here. Now that could obviously put an uneven pressure on the release bearing, and then that could cause the clutch fork to rattle more than it should. So that is also another thing that I was suspecting could be causing the rattle, and I do have a spare pressure plate in the garage, so I'm going to be changing that today. Right, so I've got the clutch off. So far, the friction plate hasn't fallen to pieces like the old one did, so that's good. It's actually harder to see that the fingers on this are uneven than it was when it was on the car. So I'm glad I had a look before I took it off. But yeah, I'm going to swap this out for a spare one that I've got in the garage. The clutch and flywheel collection. Yeah, these fingers look nice and straight, so hopefully that will cure my problems. Right, so I'm going to get the clutch parts and the flywheel all cleaned up now and get the clutch fitted. Right, so the clutch is now refitted with the different pressure plate. So now I'm going to turn my attention to the gearbox. I'm going to give it a clean out, and I'm also going to change this clutch release bearing. It hasn't been on there long, but to be honest, I like to change that every time I take the gearbox off. And then I'm going to grind away some of this bell housing just to give more clearance for the exhaust manifold. Right, so now comes the fun part of putting the gearbox back onto the engine, which sometimes can be a nightmare, but sometimes can be easy, so hopefully today it will go on really easily. Alright, so that wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it's still an absolute mission trying to do it on your own while you're laying on your back, but I don't have a ramp, so just got to get on with it. The sun's gone down, so it is going to start getting dark soon. But before I leave here today, I want to get the engine and gearbox bolted back into the car. Now I've just noticed a hole in the bulkhead. It was probably an earth point. I had the same thing on my Mark 1. I'm just going to fill it up with sealer. And as the engine's coming up, I need to get this coolant pipe back onto the water rail. Yeah, I think that hose down there is barely long enough, to be honest. It's probably going to need to get changed soon, which will be fun. Right, the engine's pretty much in now. It just needs to go back a bit, I think. See if the gearbox mounts are lined up. Right, so that's the gearbox mounts bolted up. I haven't fully tightened them up yet. I'm just going to bolt the cross member up and then I'll go around and tighten everything up. And obviously you've got to remember to put these spacers in between the cross member and the chassis, which are covered in oil thanks to Maude's leaky sump. Now I've only put one bolt in this side because, as you'll know if you've been watching my videos, the other one needs a nut welded back in the chassis. But I'll be dropping this cross member tomorrow to do the sump anyway, so. Right, so pretty soon it's going to be pitch black, so it's time for me to stop. I'm just going to go round and tighten all the cross member bolts and the gearbox mount bolts just to make sure they're tight, and then I'm going to pack up and go home. I'm really happy that I actually found something wrong with the clutch today when I took the gearbox off, so hopefully the rattle that was coming from inside the bell housing is now cured. Tomorrow I'll be round here to fit Maude's new sump, and hopefully I'll have time to fit the L.S.D as well. So yeah, things are really moving forward, and hopefully Maude will be back on the road in a couple of days. If you thought this video was any good, please do give it a thumbs up and a share. If you thought it was shit, give it a thumbs down. Click subscribe and activate the notification bell to be kept right up to date with any other videos that I post in the future. Make sure you check out my Facebook and my Instagram, and I'll leave the links you need for that in the description as well. Until next time, thanks for watching.